I'm a believer in global cooperation because I believe that the world faces very grave but solvable crises such as human-induced climate change or the remaining poverty in the midst of wealth or the dangerous misuses of technology, and that we need cooperation to solve these problems. So I recoil when I see the United States or other countries trying to divide the world rather than to create a cooperative framework. Now, I've been engaged in international policy and politics for more than 40 years now. I've worked in more than 140 countries around the world. I know world leaders. I've advised 3 Secretaries General of the United Nations. I believe that the period we're in now is more dangerous and more fraught with deep crisis than at any time in our modern history. We are closer to nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. I also know, because I've lived through it, studied it, written books about it, that the United States government, which is the government of the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful military in the world, the only country that has a military force that is with bases in more than 80 countries around the world, 800 military bases overseas from the United States, with a history of overthrowing governments through covert operations, which I've studied at length or seen with my own eyes in some sense. I know that the United States is not providing that cooperative framework, even though it is the most powerful country and it has a great responsibility to the world to act much better than it's acting right now.
But don't you think that, as Leo Strauss in the Chicago School has taught for generations, that if you don't use your power, then you'll lose your power? Isn't that a basic premise of how power relations work? And isn't what you're talking about potentially naive about how power works?
There are 2 theories of politics in Western culture. One goes back to Aristotle, and Aristotle's idea is that politics is for the common good. He wrote a very wonderful book about that called The Politics, 2,300 years ago. Its companion volume is called The Ethics, or the Nicomachean Ethics. The second theory of politics is by Machiavelli, written in its first draft in the 1510s. The prince says that politics is a game of power, and the role of the prince is to hold power. So we have 2 different images of politics: politics to solve problems and politics to maintain and manipulate power. I am an Aristotelian. I believe that politics should be for the common good. Is it? Sometimes yes, very often no. The fact that it is often the mere crass, cynical manipulation of power doesn't make Aristotle wrong. He was a philosopher saying what we should do if we want to have the kind of lives that we aim to have. Machiavelli may be descriptively more accurate at many times, but that doesn't mean we have to settle for that. That just tells us if we settle for it that we're doomed. I mentioned President Kennedy earlier as an inspiration for me. President Kennedy, in his great speech on peace in 1963, said, we should not believe that we are gripped by forces that we cannot control. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. And he says man has often solved the seemingly unsolvable problem, and he said in that speech that he believed that we could do it again. So this is a question of not how politics is, but how it should be and how it can be. And people can say this is naive. I think it's naive to follow a power politics that leads us to the nuclear abyss. How much more naive can that be? Naive relative to everything we say we want. I won't tolerate that in the sense of sitting still and saying, well, that's just how politics are. We blow up the world. No way. As long as I have a voice and energy and knowledge of what's going on, I will call out such cynical and crass behavior. And do I believe that if you don't use power, you lose it? Well, as you can see, I'm not so interested in power per se. I'm interested in peace. I'm interested in security. I'm interested in economic well-being. I'm interested in environmental sustainability. I am not interested in power per se. Power is a zero or negative sum game. Who's on top? Who's being hurt? Who can beat the hell out of whom? Those are relatively uninteresting questions. They are questions that children ask in the sandbox when they're 5 years old, but they're not the questions that should dominate our political leaders who supposedly are grown people, though they often don't behave like it.
In your work, you rarely, if ever, touch on religion. Where does an economist like yourself stand with respect to drawing on any religious traditions? Or is your position, you're a globalist, a peacemaker, that religions have a part, but in terms of just politics making, you really negotiate with philosophical principles or economic principles?
I am in fact working with many religious leaders and am very inspired by them. I am an academician of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, and I'm profoundly inspired by Pope Francis and by his two powerful encyclicals, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. Laudato Si says, and Pope Francis is very clear, that our interdependence obliges us to think of a common plan for our common home. And Fratelli Tutti is a wondrous document that says, in order to have peace, we need to encounter the other. The whole encyclical is based on the Good Samaritan, the parable of Jesus describing helping someone from another community, a Samaritan, no less. And he describes what the Good Samaritan does to save this person that's injured in the road, actually getting them care and then paying for their keep. And his message is that we need to encounter the other, otherwise we will be led to false hatreds, we will be led to self-destruction. I meet regularly with Patriarch Bartholomew, His All Holiness of the Orthodox Church, who led so much of the world in the environmental movement in recent decades. So these messages of great religious leaders are moral messages that touch us in the deepest way and are foundational in our cultural perspectives. But it's those leaders who are not being listened to right now by the political leaders who follow the Machiavellian line, who don't think about the common good, who don't think about the dangers of their citizens, who regard lives as fodder, who think that the big question is to weaken Russia through war, and many other things that I know that the U.S. government is involved in, because it says so, actually. What's remarkable also is that as much as the U.S. government lies, it occasionally tells the truth and lets out that bit, but when it does, it's quickly corrected. I can mention, for example, that in February of 2022, when President Biden met with Chancellor Scholz, he said that if Russia invades, the Nord Stream pipeline will be finished. And a reporter said, well, how can you do that? That's a Russian-German pipeline. And Biden said, we have our ways. And then when the pipeline is blown up, the Western press is, well, I wonder who did that. Probably it's the Russians blowing up their own pipeline. And the U.S. government, yeah, it's probably the Russians, even though the Americans have the motive, the means, and actually announced that they would do this very thing. But We're supposed to be stupid, according to Western propaganda. We're supposed to be easily manipulated. And when I made these basic points that it was the United States that warned that the pipeline would be finished, I was yanked off the air of a major U.S. Television program, because you're not supposed to say those things on the U.S. media. So this is really the issue. Religious leaders have an enormous amount to tell us, but our political leaders are arrogant and playing with fire and believing in the Machiavellian line that their highest purpose is maintaining power. Frankly, when I'm told that by a politician, yeah, but that would be really unpopular. I don't know if I'd win re-election. It may be the right thing to do, but would be unpopular. The first thing that I think is, who cares whether you're reelected? Your job is to help the common good. That is the essence of your responsibility as a politician. You should follow that line.
So what is your take on societies that ended up in a more dependent development role? And do you think that crippled them in terms of how they've developed economically over the past 40 years?
Basically, an economy's place in the world economy depends on many things, but it depends very much on its technological development, its education levels, its capacity to innovate, and therefore to be part of a cutting-edge world economy. And a country like the Czech Republic or Poland or Hungary or others absolutely has the capacity not to be a dependent economy selling a small number of primary commodities and so forth, but to be leading technology innovators and shapers of the world. So I'm less worried about such economies than I am about countries that are absolutely trapped in extreme poverty, or they have one commodity to sell. There's a recent study that shows that in large parts of the world, young children don't even learn the most basic skills of reading, mathematics, and science. So what's going to happen to them? That's a kind of dependency, because they will not be living in places with ability to provide decent jobs and livelihoods and so forth. So this question of dependency is real. It has a geopolitical element to it. Imperialism was a way to create and enforce and sustain and perpetuate dependency, because imperial powers, the Europeans in Africa, for example, did not educate the populations of those countries. Today, when a country is independent, its first task should be a good education of its children. This is the most important thing that any government can do. And interestingly, going back to Aristotle, he believed in public education. Going back to Adam Smith, who was the free market economist, he believed in public education and so on. And I would say that that's the key way not to be a dependent economy.
I'd be curious to see what Professor Sachs's understanding is on culture and education's role in shaping development and crisis resolution plans, especially going forward into an unprecedented recession, along with looming epidemics and a climate crisis. My question, therefore, is mostly about how Professor Sachs would approach the potential threat of overlooking these factors, culture, people, and their levels of education, etc., in the present, while focusing on the economic aspects of the conflicts today.
To repeat what I was just suggesting, when I'm asked about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I always start by saying that SDG 4, quality of education for all children, is the most important of all the Sustainable Development Goals. Education is the key at an individual level, and it's the key at a societal level for being able to create the kind of future that we want. In SDG 4 is a target, SDG Target 4.7, which says that all children should learn global citizenship, appreciation for culture, appreciation for cultural diversity. In other words, to understand we're in a diverse world, to understand a culture of peace in that diverse world. So our cultural heritage is fundamental for us as human beings and our identities, but our cultural appreciation of others is fundamental for our ability to live in an interconnected, diverse world. So education and respect and knowledge of our own cultures, but respect and knowledge of other cultures as well, and especially the respect for diversity, so that we learn to treat each other with respect and in a peaceful way.
Is international development a project of the idea that the West is good and everything else is bad? Is development capitalocentric and orientalist in nature? If so, what is a way out?
Modern economic development really began with the invention of the steam engine and the breakthrough to industrialization. And that changed economic life, created urban industrial societies. It created vast disparities of power, of economic well-being. It created the openings for European imperialism and many other of the basic structures of the modern world. When it started around 1750, it really began in England and in Western Europe for a lot of historical reasons and accidents that I describe in a recent book, The Ages of Globalization. There was no intrinsic reason why the industrial age began in Europe, but it resulted from a deeper history that one can study and understand. Suffice it to say, that put the West in the driver's seat, in the military control for 200 years. We're at the end of that phase right now. This is one of the great transformations that's taking place in our world. The Western dominance is going away because China has recovered from 150 years of great economic difficulty that one can even date to the British Wars, the Opium Wars that started in 1839 against China. But Asia is in an ascendancy since the early 1950s, since the restoration of sovereignty to China, to India, and so forth. And this is changing geopolitics, and it's changing the meaning of development itself. It can't be a Western project anymore. The West doesn't have the dominance militarily, technologically, demographically, certainly economically, that it had before. It's interesting that if you measure economies at the so-called purchasing power basis or international price basis, the BRICS countries, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, those 5 countries now have a larger combined gross output than the G7 countries, which is the United States, UK, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. And I think I said Canada in there, but the 7 countries which thought they ran the world 40 or 50 years ago. But now the BRICS countries are actually larger economically. And this means that development, and we always should say sustainable development now, because development has to be economic betterment in a context of environmental sustainability. And that's the essence of sustainable development, that economic development should be socially just and environmentally sustainable. That's not a Western project, that is a global effort, and we need to cooperate together to achieve it. That's why the whole world adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. It's why the whole world adopted the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. And I have said that the G7, which is that representation of Western power, should actually end, because we should go to the G20, which is now developed and developing countries together, not the West, but the world. And I've advocated that the G20 first should be the African Union. And so we bring Africa to the front table and really get on with a worldwide coordinated and cooperative effort to achieve sustainable development.
How do you deal with the so-called triple threat? Climate change as an existential crisis, capitalism as a material economic crisis, if you believe that, and modernity as a cultural crisis.
I believe that we start with the idea of building the future we want. And I believe that we can identify the kinds of lives that people around the world want. They want to be able to have economic security. They want to have decent nutrition, shelter, education for their children, health care, peace, social protection. Indeed, these are known as economic rights already identified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago next year, actually, since the Universal Declaration was adopted in 1948. That's the future we want. Then we ask, how do we build that? And that's a step-by-step construction project. And in a way, it is a brick at a time. You need a blueprint, you need a strategy for creating this shared world, because it is a shared and interdependent world. But it's not beyond our means to see our way forward. And when it comes to issues of climate, we know we have to change technologies. We have to decarbonize the energy system, for example. When it comes to economic systems, we know it can't be the raw free market. That's not free for most of the world. That's incredibly costly for most of the world. But it can be a mixed economic system of market, government, and civil society in a balanced way. When it comes to modernity, it means that we cherish and build on our cultural traditions, our religious traditions, our very distinct and diverse traditions, but we appreciate our global reality and our interdependence as well. And to my mind, this opens up the possibility of a future that really is one of well-being, of social justice, of sustainability, and of peace. And that is the vision of sustainable development.
Is there anything you'd like to say to students today that are just entering university that you would sort of alert them to? What's the importance of an education?
Let me say to students the words that President John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural address on January 20th, 1961. He said, "For the world is very different now. Mankind holds in his mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." What President Kennedy was saying is, it's our existential reality that with the tools that we have, we can solve fundamental problems. We can end poverty. But at the same time, with the tools that we have, we could destroy the whole world through nuclear war or environmental ruin. You as young people, this is your world. You're going to be building it. You are going to be leaders. Choose the right path. Understand that that is the fundamental moral and ethical way forward. That there are choices. There's no use in predicting the future. Build the future. Seize the future that the world wants. Do it with justice. Do it with knowledge. Do it with respect, and especially respect for others in other societies. And then we can be in a world without extreme poverty. We can be in a world in which prosperity is shared. We can be in a world of justice. We can be in a world in which the horrible dangers of climate change have been sharply reduced by the energy transformation and land transformations that we need. And especially we can be in a world of peace. This is your world. Go build the world, the future that we want.